Beautiful. Which screen are you seeing me share right now, Michelle?
I've just, all I can see is just a picture of you. That's all I can see. Just, yeah.
That's better.
There. Yep.
Perfect. All right, let's do it. Eh? You and me. All right, so we're going to look at lower limb. This is going to be jarring, but I'm going to be looking at my big screen so that I can use the laser pointer on the screen without having to jump back to my webcam. So it's going to be a little frustrating at times. I apologize.
That's cool. That's fine.
We'll make it work. Okay. So we're going to be looking at lower limb control tonight. This was supposed to be part 2, including upper and lower limb, but it's got so much in it that I can't cut out that I'm going to have to make a part 3. But I don't think that's going to be a bad thing, only because we'll have an opportunity to take the next week to go over the lower limb stuff. Plus we get the recap from last week in this as well. So let's get stuck in. So the outcomes for tonight, we're going to be recapping the pillar and 4 postures related to the ground, and then principles of force production and absorption as we talk about how that force is navigated throughout the lower quarter zones of control. So we move in and let's do our quick recap here. So we've got the pillar, based on what we talked about last week, defined by the 4 key structures. We've got our shoulder girdle, our spinal column, our rib cage, and our pelvic girdle, and they create kind of like a rectangle, or if you think about a pillar that holds up a roof, they create this pillar, and that pillar helps us navigate force coming in either from the legs or from the arms, and it helps us transmit or redirect that force back down into the floor again. We go on to posture. So we're looking at the way that we define posture in terms of this, I guess this mentorship, is that it's defined simply as a position within a pattern. So the way that we navigate from position to position, we can define that simply as poise. So a movement pattern, depending on how clean it is, we can determine that as either poiseful or less poiseful. But position is just simply a posture that's a snapshot in time of that pattern. And then the motor control that comes with that, the cleanliness of that pattern, can be defined as poise or clean motor control. And then we talked about how there aren't typically any good or bad postures, just more ideal and less ideal task-specific positions within a functional pattern that we discussed in the last webinar. Okay, and then we move into our positions. So position 1, as this recap here, is supine. So we're on our back, and this is a supported position, a fully supported position for the pillar. So there is no gravity, there's no load going through the spine or the adjacent structures. This lady here is just laying on her back, and no load is passing through her pillar. So this is the ideal position for bringing attention to tension or pain within the system. And we find a position of ease in this supported position to start building a platform of movement on. Position 2 is quadruped or suspended. And this is where we take our arms and our legs and we now suspend the pillar horizontal to the ground. So we still don't have any axial load, some compressional load going through that spine. It's a little bit of shear force, but we're being supported in 4 key positions here. So this suspended posture, this introduces some partial weight bearing through the spine via shoulder girdle and pelvic girdle, which are the 2 top and bottom gateways to the pillar. Also, this is our first position where we can start to introduce a anti-flexion and anti-extension moment within a pattern and introduce that with breathing to create higher tier function away from our supported or supine position. Position 3A is our half kneeling or our stacked position. Stacked because this is the first time we introduce compressive or axial load through the spine. So we are stacking the spine and the pillar over the hips, and we are trying to balance the center of mass across 2 hips, one on the floor and the other posted out in front. And then position 3B is our tall kneeling. So we are still stacked, but in this position, we have a much narrower base of support than we do here. Here is a little bit broader than here. We're still introducing the same spinal or compressional axial loading through the spine and the pelvis. And then position 4 is our standing position. And this is typically where we get to produce most of our force, and we're also at our most maneuverable due to these little bad boys at the bottom of our legs called our feet. Okay, so we're gonna move into our lower limb control zones. There's two, but there's 3 parts that make these up. So we've got our 3 parts here: the foot, the knee, and the hip. And as you'll see, as we move into each of these complexes, they work in sync with each other. They synergize quite well together. But the caveat there is that when one area starts to misbehave, that can cause a chain reaction of misbehavior up or down the chain based on where that dysfunction may occur or that misbehavior may occur. So if we move into our ankle complex, we're going to be looking at the way that we produce force, transmit force, or absorb force from the ground through the foot. So this first sentence here, when we're discussing force production, transmission, or absorption, our first and last stop is the foot. Remember that force is produced from the ground via gravity. So gravity is interpreted by our nervous system as an external load that we push against to stand up. And that standing up is creating force, and that force is created via the ground through our feet. So foot function is quite important. I hold a lot of stock in foot function, and we're going to see why in a couple more slides. But just understand that the way that we produce force, regardless of if we're lifting weight, or if we're running, or if we're tackling someone or being tackled, or if we're just sitting on the couch and standing up, we're producing that through the floor. And every sort of micronewton of force that we produce into the floor must be absorbed and recognized within the nervous system so that we can navigate the perturbations that come with that, particularly if we're using our feet, which are small, narrower bases of support. So force is produced through our contact with the ground, and healthy inputs received from the ankle complex can and will play a significant part in your ability to access patterns both in an open and a closed chain. So I mean, you guys should understand this already, but just in case you don't and you need a recap, an open chain means that the distal segment is not fixed, which would be here. And then a closed chain, just mute your mic, whoever just came in. And then a closed chain would be a distal segment that is fixed. So in this case, it would be the foot on the ground. Then we move into the complex that it's made up of. So this complex is made up of several joints, which we'll explore in the next slide. And while these sections, these joints, they appear to be different, and they all appear to kind of not have a lot of mobility, they don't have a lot of movement associated with them, they work together via movement patterns throughout this whole complex that help to create a really strong foundation and clean pathways for force to travel straight up the leg. Force likes to travel in straight lines, particularly when it's moving in and around the pillar. And then this last one here, remember, so this is just a cheeky note to remember as we move forward. Joints don't work in isolation. We can test them in isolation to see if they've got adequate amounts of range, but they never work in isolation based on the way that our spine is responsible for creating stability, a stable base to produce movement off. So if you were to lay on your back in position 1, a supported position, and just lift your leg, you will feel your pillar, your spine, your pelvis, your shoulder girdle. You'll even feel your arms. They will tension themselves to create some stability for you to lift that leg off. And that's very important to understand. No joints work in isolation because the nervous system doesn't work in isolation. So these joints throughout the foot, they're actually specifically designed, just like all the joints within the kinetic chain, are designed to specifically function as a way of supporting the surrounding soft tissue of the joint that is connected to that joint, and also to the next joints within sequence throughout the entire kinetic chain, all the way from the foot up to the head. Because gravity doesn't just affect one joint, it affects the entire system. Very important to understand and remember. Now we move into the ankle complex, and as you can see, it is quite complex, but in its complexity, we can chop and change a few things to make it a little bit more simple. But let's just dive in. So we've got our ankle complex, and there are many, many different bones. They're all color coded differently here. There are many different bones working together here to create as much intrinsic stability as they can. So you can see that a lot of these bones, they're long, but we don't have these huge gaps in terms of the bone throughout the foot. There's a lot of tissue that sits in between these bones. And if I was to palpate a foot, I can palpate and get a bit of movement through those bones, but not a whole lot, because the skin and the fascia that wraps the skin is holding that very tight. So this entire complex here is actually designed for a lot of intrinsic stability, which means not a lot of movement. And the reason we don't want a lot of movement is because we need to base the rest of our body's support off a very narrow, in the sagittal plane, very narrow base of support. Now these pieces, even though they don't need a lot of movement, they still need to be able to move relative to one another. Now this movement, this mobility, is not always going to be easy to measure or assess, and that's going to be true for a lot of the bones throughout the rest of the lower body through the control zones. But that movement still exists, and it exists via functional or accessory movement. And we're going to break into some more of that functional and accessory movement thought process as we go. But just understand that even the stiffest bone on each side still needs a little bit of give, because if it doesn't have that give, it hasn't got the ability to absorb force coming into it across the bone. And it's very important that that's what we remember joints do. Joints don't just help us move through space, they help us navigate the force that comes across a bone. And these joints here, that's exactly what they do. They help us navigate the force that crosses these bones, because these bones are very important for creating leverage through the toes all the way into this midfoot section here, these tarsals. Let's keep going though. So where were we? The movement. So we've got this movement throughout the foot that we need, and it's important because we need it for anti-movement. If we don't have the ability to have some of that accessory movement in the foot, then we lose the shock absorption, or we lose the anti-movement ability of that foot. So a stiffer foot isn't necessarily better if we don't know how to use that stiffness. Just as a springy, supple foot isn't necessarily better if we don't know how to land soft and absorb force through the foot. So we've got a lot of bones in here, and this can be quite overwhelming, but let's quickly go through them here. So we've got our distal phalanges here, and these are the yellow bad boys. Our middle phalanges here are these green ones, and our proximal phalanges here, and they sit through this, I beg your pardon, sorry. Middle phalanges here are these green ones, and the proximal phalanges here are these teal colored ones. And these are designed to create sectional leverage it's called toeing off, as we move through gait cycles. So as I step this foot into the ground, and then the foot moves past my hips and I'm stepping off onto my next step, these toes, they create this sectional leverage where I'm creating movement, small little movements or small little flexion and extension moments throughout these joints. So I'm not creating a whole lot of tension up through these tarsal bones up in the foot. These tarsal bones here are designed for a little bit of shock absorption, but this is where much of the shock absorption comes from due to the nature of this flexibility through these sectional levers. Then we move into this purple area, which are our metatarsals. And again, these act just as longer sectional levers. So now we're trying to create movement, and a little bit of anti-movement as we move into the stiffer sections of the foot. So we're moving, and now we're creating a little bit of anti-movement. And you can see as these bones get a little denser that we're not going to be getting as much movement out of these sections of the foot. These tarsal bones create the firm bottom plate of the foot that you can roll backwards and forwards within the frontal plane, or within the frontal plane. And underneath here, we've got our ankle bone, which we're going to explore in the next slide, and then our fibula and our tibia that sit on top and attach our foot to our leg. So that's essentially the ankle complex, but we can make it a little less complex and a little bit more simpler for our purposes. So if we move into this ankle complex and make it a little simpler, all we can do is just look at it a little bit more pragmatically. The forefoot houses many of the phalanges, and if we remember, those phalanges, they're just designed for sectional leverage. So the more distal sections move a little bit more to create the space for our anti-flexing or our anti-moving sections to absorb some of that force. So our forefoot does a lot of movement, and it does it in sections. Our midfoot, so that's these more purple bad boys, they're not necessarily designed for a whole lot of movement, but because they're longer, they're designed to resist or absorb a little bit more movement. Then we move into our hind foot, our tarsals. And again, this isn't really designed for a lot of movement. There's going to be slight joint play here for shock absorption, but not a whole lot. And this is where our subtalar joint, or the joint that allows us for inversion or eversion of the foot, exists. And it exists by housing itself just underneath these little bad boys here. This is called your malleolus. So we're looking at a right foot here. This would be the inside of that right foot, or the medial malleolus. And then you've got your lateral malleolus on the other side. And then underneath here, this little purple mass, this is your ankle joint that allows for flexion or plantar flexion, dorsiflexion within the sagittal plane. And this is completely encased, like a dome, completely encased within this tibia and fibula pairing. And that's called your talocrural joint. And we're about to look at these in terms of what we can expect from movement. So let's just quickly recap, just to make it a little bit less complex. Forefoot encompasses the phalanges, so that's here. And that's designed for a bit of movement. So we need that extension through these toes as we toe off. If we don't have the extension, then we can put a little bit more stress through these sections of the foot or further up into the knee or the hip. The more proximal we get, the less we have of this sort of, I'm going to say flex, but it's not actually flexing in terms of anatomical movement, but there is a flex in terms of allowing for that movement to occur. Now, it's not easy to measure these, but we should still try our best. If I was going to suggest measuring something, I would pick the big toe and ensure that we're getting 40 to 50 degrees of extension in our big toe. So that's lifting the toe off the ground in an open chain, which is to say that we're not assessing it with the toe fixed to the ground as we move the foot. So we're wanting to see if we can get 40 to 50 degrees of open chain, big toe extension. As restrictions start to ease with Corona, I'll be able to run you guys through these assessments either in the shed in Frankston or up at Ballarat with Radders. So don't fret, I can run you guys through these in future, but just understand that these ranges exist so that we can take stress off other structures above or below. Now, the big toe is the most distal segment of the foot and the lower limb. If we don't have it, then we're creating more stress further up. Remember, if this doesn't extend, then these pieces that become less movable the closer we get to the midfoot, they take on more stress. And so too does the knee above. Now we've got plantar flexion, which is we stand and we point our toes and we push into a calf raise. Now, when we go into plantar flexion, we're actually going into big toe closed chain extension. And if we don't have big toe extension in the open chain, then we're going to have a hard time assessing plantar flexion in a closed chain environment. I recommend measuring plantar flexion in a closed chain if you're confident that you haven't missed anything with big toe, because there's a great way to assess motor control there as well. Now, plantar flexion, we're looking for 40 to 50 degrees. Is it easy to measure? Not necessarily, but if we know where 0 is, which is the floor, and we know where 90 degrees is, which is just a right angle, all you have to do is watch where the midfoot, so we're starting here, the midfoot, this is the part that will come off the ground. These parts won't. So there's the ball of your foot. The midfoot will come off the ground and create a lever. We're watching for where this lever and this malleolus, if we draw a straight line, we just want to know where that straight line finishes. Does it get past 45? If it does, let's call it between 40 and 50. Does it not get close enough to 45? If it doesn't and you're not sure, then just mark it down and say, look, we're probably a little short on plantar flexion. Go and check big toe extension. We might be missing big toe extension. Dorsiflexion. So we need 20 degrees in an open chain and 40 degrees in a closed chain. With dorsiflexion, so 20 degrees in your open chain, due to the natural ropey sort of elastic properties of the calcaneal tendon, the Achilles tendon, it can be really challenging to measure dorsiflexion in an open chain. So this is where you've got to have really sort of confident clinical skills or clinical handling skills and assessment skills. If you're not particularly confident or you haven't got good control over the foot within your assessment, again, that's something that I can teach you guys, or you can jump in and do some assessment courses. The SFMA is a great one for that, selective functional movement assessment through FMS. That's where I learned a lot of this. If you don't have those skills, then you can absolutely just measure dorsiflexion in a closed chain. Are you going to be missing some pieces of the puzzle? Sure. But at the end of the day, you're at least getting a firm idea of what the foot can do in relation to the knee. All you need to do is just get yourself a clinometer. You can get one on your smartphone or you can purchase one. And you fix the clinometer to a fixed point. Again, I can run you through this in the garage or when I'm up in Ballarat as well. The goal is to fix the clinometer on a flat surface. So if we're doing dorsiflexion in a closed chain position, we'll be in a half kneeling position. And we're going to fix that clinometer on the flat bony surface of the shin, just below the tibial tuberosity. And what we do is just translate forward into our ankle clearance test or our ankle measurement test. And we can use that to record how many degrees of clean dorsiflexion we get. And then we can measure that to the other side. We're looking for a minimum of 40. If you want to be able to squat with any modicum of depth and not have to be compensating through the foot, the knee, or the hip, or the lower back, 40 degrees is the minimum. There's a couple of papers that have been published that if you ask me very nicely, I will go and dig for them in my EndNote somewhere. But 40 degrees is the happy minimum. You can get away with less. I get away with less, but it's not recommended if you want to dive into the world of performance. Inversion and eversion are challenging because while they have an axis that they move on, that axis is actually rotation, and it's very hard to measure an axis of rotation without a fixed point. So what I like to suggest with inversion and eversion is so you can sit yourself down in a seated position and then just try to lift the inside of your feet towards each other and then the outsides of your feet away from each other. This is inversion and eversion. And what we're trying to do is assess whether or not someone can do that in the presence of a tibia, a shin bone that stays vertical. This is our first introduction when we come to assessing movement patterns of moving parts versus non-moving parts. So this is an example where I can sit someone down and assess their ability to invert and evert. Without having to measure it, I can say comfortably, you're not meeting the criteria I need because I can see that you're struggling to keep your shins from getting involved in the process. So they either have an inability to access that inversion, eversion, it could be a mobility restriction, or they have a motor control deficit. If they have a motor control deficit, I can just challenge that with some dynamic or static stability through the foot or the lower quarter, these lower limb control zones. And if they have a mobility restriction, well, then I can either use my hands to create more range, or I can get creative as a coach if I don't have those manual handling skills. But I use my eyes for inversion and eversion. That's a visual assessment for me. And again, I'm watching the non-moving parts rather than the moving parts. Okay. We move into the knee complex. The knee complex, as force travels up through the ankle complex, it meets the first of several long... Oh, by the way, I'm sorry that my animations aren't working tonight. When I transferred it from my main computer to my laptop, my animations didn't carry over. I'm really annoyed because now it feels like a uni lecture and it really annoys me. I'm sorry. As force travels up through the ankle complex, it meets the first of several long bones that create a vertical line of force. Remember, force likes to travel in straight lines up towards our center of mass. So this moves through our tibia and our fibula. The first point where these vertical lines change direction dynamically is at the knee. So if I'm standing in a straight line, then the force is moving in a straight line from my foot all the way to my spine. If I'm moving, then the force is being translated differently based on how my knee or the position that my knee is in when my foot touches the floor, and the knee that the position that my knee is in when it passes across where my midline is or my center of mass is. So we're talking about walking essentially. You can imagine my knee is in a different position. It's not in a typical extended position. When I reach out and touch my heel to the floor, there's a soft bit of flexion. And also my knee isn't in rigid extension as I move through my hip extension and my gait cycle. So the knee is a complex that is quite complex, and I really like it. And I hope you guys will too after this, these next couple of slides. So the knee is its own complex with its own intricate ways of navigating forces being delivered either up to the hips or back down to the ground. Remember, all force that we generate or produce from the ground must come back down to the ground as well. The most complex part about the knee, however, and my favorite, is that the function of the knee changes based on whether it is flexed or not, or whether it is flexed or extended. Note, it is difficult to discuss knee function without considering hip function. Did I just draw something on the thing? That's pretty cool. Okay, I don't know how I did that. It is difficult to discuss knee function without considering...
Sorry, that was me.
Oh.
I don't know what the hell I did.
Thanks, Lockie. Good show. Good job from you, Matt.
No worries, mate. Hold on, I can get rid of it too.
Thanks, Matt. Let's get the hell out of me. I was like, what the hell? Oh, that's cool. So it is difficult to discuss knee function without considering hip function. They are both so closely interlinked in terms of agonist and antagonist tissues and pattern synchronization that assessing one without the other is missing at least half the puzzle. The same goes for the joint below, the ankle complex as well. So the knee is quite a dumb joint, and you can actually play with this now. If you're sitting down, just kick your leg out straight. Your knee won't point wherever your foot doesn't. So you can't, in a straight leg, you can't point your knee unless you're pointing your foot and your hip there as well. So the knee is quite a dumb joint, but in that simplicity is actually quite a lot of complexity, because when we bend the knee, the rules change based on the length and tension of tissues around the knee and the hip. I like the knee a lot. I think it's a lot of fun. So in this position here, I'm going to move this over here actually, just so that I can be a little bit more. That's better. Now I don't have to keep doing this. So beautiful. So we've got 3 different positions here. We've got a standing position, a seated position, and a standing position with the knee bent. So what we're looking at here is 3 different positions, but they're not different in terms of anatomy, because the anatomy doesn't change. We've still got the same amount of bones, same amount of muscle, same amount of tendons, same amount of ligaments. What we're changing the positions relative to the ground and the hip. And that's very important to understand. We're not changing the anatomy. And this is a bugbear of mine. We're not changing the anatomy. We are changing the positions relative to the hip and the floor, the ground. So when we understand these different positions, we actually change the movement mechanics quite drastically. So in the first image here, we're in a standing hip and knee extended position. So if you can see here, where are we? There we go, the first position. So we're in this standing hip and knee extended position. And in this knee extended position, our anterior and our posterior thigh muscles work to lock the knee. So the tibia on the femur, or tibiofemoral joint, which is just here, we lock that in place from accessing further range. And this function is based on the congruency, or the shape, of the femur as it sits within the grooves on the tibial plateau. So this is the meniscus of the knee. It creates some grooves, and you'll see that in the next slide. So in this position, the nervous system is working to manage the center of mass over a very narrow base of support, which is obviously the feet, because the feet are connected to the ground, and that's where we transfer force back down into. So we're producing force from the ground, and we're transferring it back down as well to create stability. And so the knee is extended relative to the ground rather than relative to the hip. And we're going to move on to this one, and maybe you'll start to see the pattern here. So in this second image here, we've changed the functional demands on the knee by changing the load demands of the knee relative to the hip. So here, our center of mass is, or center of gravity, where they're different, but is based over the midfoot. Here, it's based not over the seat, but based between the 2 points that we are fixed to. So it's based here. If I was to take my foot off the ground, it would be based here over the seat. I'm going to read that first line again. In the second image, we have changed the functional demands on the knee by changing the load demands on the knee relative to the hip. As a result, this has changed the congruency of the knee, which you'll see in the next slide, as we will see in the following slide. But the important thing to note here is the different changes in anterior and posterior tissue. So if we're in this hip flexed position, our anterior thigh tissues, have they shortened or have they lengthened? Throw me out an answer while I take a sip.
Lengthened.
Lengthened.
Same.
So we think that in this hip flexed position, our anterior, our quad muscles have lengthened.
Is recfem lengthened or is that shortened?
Correct. So we're in a hip flexed position. Are we hip flexed relative to the ground or relative to the knee? And this is where the difference comes in, right? What about our posterior thigh muscles? Have they lengthened or have they shortened?
Shortened.
They're shortened, right? Because the posterior thigh muscles, the hamstrings, they help to flex the knee and extend the hip. Our anterior thigh muscles, our quad muscles, they help to flex the knee and, extend the knee and flex the hip. So in a seated position, our quad muscles have actually shortened because it's passive. We're not actively hip flexing. It's passive. However, there are going to be some constraints on that. I just want you guys to understand the difference that we're going to come into on this third one. Relative to the hip and the knee, we haven't really seen an extensive length change in either the anterior or the posterior because they're both passively moving the same distance. But if we're going to split hairs, they're kind of both shortening. Because you've got your origin and insertion on the front side moving closer together and your origin and insertion on the back side moving closer together. So in this second image, where we've changed the load demand on the knee relative to the hip, we've actually created shortened muscle through both. So we've changed the functional demands of the knee in a knee flexed position in a hip flexed position, which is why I friggin' love the knee. And then we go into image 3. So we're back in a standing position and we've again changed our knee position. But I'll ask you guys this, have we changed our knee position relative to the ground or relative to the hip?
Relative to the hip.
What do you guys think? Relative to the hip or relative to the ground? Let me ask you this, have the quads gotten shorter or longer?
Longer.
Yep. Have the hamstrings gotten shorter or longer?
Shorter.
So we have changed our knee angle relative to the hip. Here we've changed our knee angle relative to the ground. So it's just open and close change, just a different way of thinking about it. Oh, let's get that bad boy off. Does that make sense or no?
Yep.
Boys?
Yeah, then.
This is something that we can...
Yeah, for the most part.
It'll make more sense when you see what the ankle and knee complex do with each other. But in an open chain environment, we're changing knee position relative to the hip. In a closed chain environment, we're changing knee position relative to the ground. So in a knee extension position, there's still that red dot there. That's so good. In a knee, that's got me. In a knee extension position, as the knee sits in extension, anatomical locking of the tibia onto the femur takes place. This functional complex is known as the key lock and happens via a lower limb muscle called the popliteus. It works differently depending on whether this knee is flexed or extended, whether you're in an open or closed chain as well. In a knee extended position, the popliteus will work to laterally rotate the femur onto the tibia, securing the femur and tibia within the sagittal plane. This is another one where people like to split hairs, but I like to think of it as if you're locking your knee out, then you're screwing the femur, into the tibia rather than the tibia into the femur. And you'll see why. This process helps to create straight line tension. Again, force likes to move in straight lines, aiding in directional force or directing force from the ground straight into the pillar. But the nature of this lock makes the knee joint in this position particularly susceptible to sudden and violent changes in force direction, such as high external impact, like a tackle, or a plant or pivot, which is also known as cutting, as an individual changes their direction. So it's designed specifically to aid in creating straight line tension and force in a straight line. However, it works against the body when we are trying to move or navigate force in the other two planes. But that doesn't mean that the knee is a bad joint. It just means that we have to consider the way we think about it. So now my favorite, we can start to see this congruency of the knee. In a flexed position and in an open chain, the popliteus will work to medially rotate the tibia under the femur. So here is where you can put your foot on the ground and don't let your thigh bone move, and you'll be able to spin your foot on an axis. This is tibiofemoral rotation, and this is popliteus and biceps femoris with a little bit of semitendinosus as well, getting involved to create spin at the tibia, internally and externally. In a knee flexed position and in a closed chain, this is very important, especially for any powerlifters that might be watching. The tibia will not rotate because the foot will be secure on the floor. Instead, the tibia will work to create a stable platform for the femur to rotate on as the hip moves through flexion as well. So we're thinking about a squat. I'm going to reiterate this again. Open chain, you'll be able to spin your foot internally and externally. In a closed chain, you can't do that because your foot is fixed on the floor. But what you will be able to do is create rotation at your femur. You can't create much rotation at your femur when you're trying to open chain spin your tibiofemoral joint. It's important to understand here. So I'll ask the question because we've got 5 minutes before I have to start a new recording. Thanks, Zoom. What are some implications that may arise from a tibia that does not medially rotate in an open chain? Will it allow for that open chain rotation, that upper chain rotation, so the femur, in a closed chain environment? Based on what we know about mobility, motor control, and dynamic static stability of joints within a sequence or pattern, what do you guys think will occur if I was to load this lower body flexion pattern, so a squat? What do you think I might see that will give away that this person may be missing open chain tibiofemoral rotation, internal rotation? What's something that you guys think I might see? Throw them out. There's one big giveaway. But there's
Something at the foot?
Huh?
Is that the foot or the hip? Is that the foot?
Tell me, man. You tell me. There'll be a lot of things that I might see, but there'll be one big one.
Is it like knees collapse, like inward?
That could be one, yeah. I could see a big valgus movement.
Valgus, yeah.
The
I was
foot
thinking,
turning outwards.
yeah.
Say again.
Foot turning outwards.
100%. That's the big one. I'll see the foot spin. I'll see the foot spin out. And when the foot spins out, I sit there and go, oh, someone's missing some tibiofemoral internal rotation. When you cannot rotate against that tibia, you lose the ability to manage force, torque at the hip joint because you have nothing to externally rotate against. So you'll create your external rotation at the hip by spinning the foot out on the floor. Now, the problem with that, if you guys remember back to webinar 2, can anyone help me define flexibility and why flexibility at a joint is important? We have 3 minutes before it kicks us out and I have to restart this Zoom. So we're not in a rush. That wasn't sarcastic. We're not in a rush.
That shit's so simple, but can't remember.
It's simple when you start to see the pieces fall into place. So flexibility is contractility of tissue. So we are looking to
Muscle tissue.
see about the contractility, the 360 degrees of contractility around a joint. Because remember, joints move through 360 degrees. They don't move in 2D, they move in 3D. We see them move in 2D, but they move in 3D. So if I'm missing the ability to access external rotation based on the flexibility of my internal or external rotators, then I'm going to lose the ability to produce torque or successive induction. I'm going to lose the ability to navigate successive induction throughout a pattern. If I'm in end range external rotation because my external rotators are too tight, then they have contracted to their end range too early and they can no longer produce force to get me out of that position. Also, they can no longer create stability for my internal rotators. So what's going to happen is at the bottom of my squat, when I come out, my nervous system is going to go looking for length because length and tension dictates that a longer muscle is going to be able to produce more force. It's going to sit there and say, you've run out of contractility in external rotators and they help you extend the hip. So what I'm going to have to do is find a muscle that's nice and long to help me get out of this hole before I can get the glutes to help. Hey, adductors, you're going to help me. And I'm going to valgus as I drive out of the hole of my squat. Now that could be a flexibility issue at the hip, or it could be a lack of internal rotation at the tibia. There's so many factors. No answer is right. But if you have a more holistic approach to movement and how movement patterns work with each other and that no pieces work in isolation, you'll start to see that these problems like a spinning foot can easily be managed by thinking a little bit differently about the movement pattern itself. Does this person have enough length at their glutes to actually achieve end range hip flexion and maintain stability of the hip? Do they have enough length at their adductors that they're able to achieve external rotation? Do they have enough spin at their tibiofemoral joint? This is a very deep Alice in Wonderland approach to movement, but this is what gets me excited about movement patterns, particularly when I load them and particularly when I get to work with athletes that lift a lot of weight, because you can make big changes by changing very small things without the movement patterns or without the throughout their parts, and then helping them reintegrate those into their movement patterns, all based on understanding these little things. What happens to a knee joint in open and closed chain knee flexion, knee extension? What happens to a hip joint in open and closed chain hip flexion, hip extension? What happens to a knee joint in open and closed chain hip extension and flexion, et cetera, which we're going to explore in the next little bit. So what I'm going to do is pause it here and then save this video. I'm going to Control R. I think that's record. Nope. Is it? It's Alter. Okay.